Welcome back to the podcast Humming Music, where we talk about all things music. Today I'll be talking about three different composers: Johann Sebastian Bach, commonly known as J.S. Bach from the Baroque era; Ludwig van Beethoven, whose career spanned the transition from the classical period to the Romantic era; and lastly, John Milton Cage from the 20th century avant-garde era. Today's episode is centered around one specific piece from each composer: Bach's six-voice fugue, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and Cage's controversial 4 minutes and 33 seconds. We will be zeroing in on the concept of structure in each piece and how they went about putting together their compositions. I have a few questions I want you to keep in mind during this podcast. First, is there one way to structure music? And second, how did these three composers use their unique forms of structure to perform their piece and convey a message to their individual audiences? To kick things off, let's go in chronological order and start with Bach, who is considered to be one of the greatest composers of all time and the creator of many masterpieces of church and instrumental music during the Baroque era. Bach was widely known for his incredible ability to improvise music. There's actually a famous story that in 1747, Bach travels to Berlin, Germany, and he ends up going to the city of Potsdam, where Frederick the Great, who was the king of Prussia at the time, wanted Bach to play him a fugue on the pianoforte. For some background, Bach was particularly famous for creating a lot of different fugues with a whole array of different voices. Okay, now back to the story. First, Frederick played for Bach a theme of his own, and then basically asked Bach to improvise a fugue on it. After Bach improvised a three-voice fugue for Frederick, the king basically challenged him and said to him, Bach, I want you to create an even more spectacular fugue with twice as many voices. I want you to do it with 6 voices, which is a very, very difficult thing and a very challenging task to create. However, this was not something that Bach was going to turn down, and he actually ended up improvising a 6-voice fugue on a theme of his own. But actually, on his return to the city of Leipzig, which is where Bach performed and ended up writing down a lot of his music that he improvised, he would write down this 6-voice fugue on the royal theme. And he would have it printed out with a whole array of other works for the king, and he sent it to King Frederick essentially as a quote-unquote musical offering. And this is what it would be known in history as when he sent this, what was seen as a gift to Frederick. And Bach was able to really impress the monarch by creating this fugue on the spot. Bach didn't prepare this in advance. He did it right all in front of Frederick. And what is so amazing about Bach is that he has this ability to either pre-prepare music or improvise music that can be just as structured as one that was prepared before ever being performed. You know, whether it be his use of the ritornello form, where essentially a passage or theme returns in the music almost like a chorus, such as in his Brandenburg concertos, or his use of a cadenza, where, he would basically be playing a solo on the harpsichord in his works, and he would even, improvise and sort of show off his musical abilities. Or, to the fullest extent of improvisation, when he improvised for Frederick the Great. So J.S. Bach really proved that musical structure can come from a piece even if it was created on the spot. And while at first his quote-unquote musical offering to King Frederick the Great was an improvisation, once he actually wrote it down and performed it, it officially became structured. So in my personal view, Bach illustrates that music doesn't always need to follow the conservative view of being performed a certain way, but rather structure can come from the replaying of a once improvised piece of music. It doesn't need to be written down first and really kind of edited very closely and then performed for the first time. You could improvise it and then perform it after writing it down. So Bach is a really interesting composer and truly a revolutionary for his time. But next, let's talk about Ludwig van Beethoven. Unlike Bach, Beethoven composed his music during the time of the rise of musical critics. He wasn't performing for dukes or elites in society like Bach did, but actually performed before anyone who he pleased. Still, Beethoven didn't spend as much time improvising music, but rather looking for different ways to enhance and improve classical musical structures. He spent his life and musical career influencing the piano sonata, the violin sonata, the piano concerto, the string quartet, and the symphony, which is what he was extremely famous for. He would not compose the piece before writing it down, but rather, he made many sketches with a lot of editing to make sure he performed and created music to the best of his ability. He essentially compiled fragments of many musical ideas and put them together to create his entire piece. Now, I want to talk about perhaps one of Beethoven's most famous symphonies and most famous pieces more broadly, Symphony No. 5. While Frederick the Great, as I discussed earlier with Bach, was really amazed by J.S. Bach's ability to improvise, what impressed Beethoven's audiences was his ability to have a set structure that would be easy to follow. Let's take the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for example. This movement is in sonata form, which has an exposition with two themes, one in major key and one in contrasting key. So a primary theme, a secondary theme, and a closing theme. The exposition is then repeated, and then Beethoven moves into the development section of the piece where, as it sounds, the music develops and new themes appear. The recapitulation occurs after the movement's development section and presents once more the musical themes from the movement's exposition. Finally, the piece ends with an emphatic coda. What makes Beethoven's music so unique and his compositions to be so great is that while he sticks to these classical structures that have been used in the past, he will surprise the audience with different changes to the structure, such as a very extended, longer coda that he included in his Fifth Symphony. Unlike Bach, who improvised and used his improvisations to turn into his final draft of music, Beethoven created many rough drafts for his 9 symphonies, including his famous Fifth. While Bach was a big proponent of simply playing on the go and creating music from improvisation, Beethoven seems more strict in that he's very focused on having a standardized structure before ever performing before an audience. To summarize, Beethoven used similar structures to his predecessors, such as Haydn and Mozart. However, unlike creating his own structure from pure improvisation, Beethoven typically followed a standard template as a structure and varied it to his liking. At the time, this was an easy way to keep the attention of your audience, while simultaneously varying the structure a bit to surprise them with something new, exciting, and original in order to convey a message and incorporate emotions and feelings in his work. Last, but definitely not least, we have the 20th century avant-garde era composer John Milton Cage, who created the controversial piece 4 minutes and 33 seconds. This piece is simply done by a performer or performers being silent on stage for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, with the silence being separated into 3 movements. There is no voice, no instrumentals, and no indication to the audience when it is the start or end of a movement. And what gives this piece its structure is simply the length of the composition. What Cage wants to show us is that the term music is all-encompassing. While most music has pitches, rhythm of some kind, Cage illustrates that anything can be music if we have the intention to listen to it as music. Even though his piece is completely silent, the background noise created by other things could be considered the real music if we think about them as sounds coming together rather than simply objects or people making random noises. Cage used what seems to be a quote-unquote basic structure at best, and probably as no structure at all according to his critics, as a way to teach a very deep and meaningful message. Essentially, that any sounds that we listen to with the intention of it being music can be considered music. He also teaches us that the duration of music has importance. A 5-minute piece of music will most likely have a very different effect than a 30-minute piece of music. His last point he tries to make is that music isn't simply based on its content, but the message it sends to the audience. You don't need a classical structure like Beethoven to present and perform music. Sure, it worked for Beethoven to carefully put together his piece before performing it, but Bach was able to perform his own work by improvising and then putting it together as a structured piece. Truly any sounds you listen to can be music. Amazingly, Cage teaches us why we can appreciate 2 very unique composers like Beethoven and Bach. Form is for sure an important aspect of music, but there's no one form or one way to compose music, and Cage illustrates just that with 4 minutes and 33 seconds. When Cage performed 4 minutes and 33 seconds, it was quite controversial, and in my opinion, I was confused by it at first as well. However, it now represents one of those things that allows you to appreciate music in all of its forms. Overall, I think we could see that there is no one way to structure or prepare music. Perhaps this is why music has been enjoyed throughout time in so many different ways. So I want to thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and I hope to see you all again next week.